go for launch.
5.
Quiet, numbskulls. I'm broadcasting. Anything can happen in the next half hour.
4.
My friend, we cannot keep this a secret any longer.
This whole thing is insane.
3.
Quiet, please. I am analyzing.
Where's the kaboom?
2.
There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom.
1.
Greetings, my fellow galactic travelers, and welcome back to Planet 8. This is your mission commander Larry speaking to you from our hidden base. Chief Engineer Bob is here by my side as always in the command center, and circling Planet 8 in our orbital spy satellite is Reconnaissance Officer Karen.
On this episode of Planet 8, we have a special guest joining us live, although we're recording, from Tippett Studios, Webster Colcord. Webster's been in the industry working various effects, starting with California Raisins on through Pirates of the Caribbean. And straight away, let's kick it over to the Chief. Chief, why don't you give us some more details of Webster? And Webster, welcome to the program.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, I don't think I need to give too many details. Webster can do that. But it's really cool to have him here, especially since he's sitting in the middle of Tippett Studios as we speak. So, Webster, why don't you take us way back to, I know your main love was always stop motion animation. So why don't you talk about how your love started and how you got in the business?
How my love started, that sounds a bit like a George Bush misstep. But anyway, I should say also that I am not supposed to be out of the house, during the pandemic here, but there's nobody at Tippett Studios, and one of the great, I've helped Phil out a lot on his personal art film, Mad God. So, I kind of come here a lot to just use the shop and stuff, and he's more or less okay with that. So nobody's given me permission to be here, but I wanted to get away. Any excuse to get out of the house these days, and so anyway, and I'm surrounded by, it's a good atmosphere for the show because I've got the dragon from Dragon Slayer is about 15 feet away from me, Vermithrax pejorative. And
that's
she's
good social distancing.
Good. Yeah. Well, for a dragon, you want to give at least 40 feet given the fire. But anyway, she is holding up pretty well. It was in the possession of the director for a couple of decades, and then he sent it back up to Phil a couple of years ago, and Phil had it restored. And so that's, I still have to pinch myself whenever I'm at the studio, sitting, animating on the computer, because this thing that was so monumental from my childhood is just around the corner. But anyway, I got started in stop motion way back in the photochemical days of the 80s. I started really young, and I started in a good place at the Vinton Studio right after the California Raisins had hit big, and they were expanding to do television specials for CBS. And so the first show I worked on was actually an Emmy nominated the Claymation Christmas special. So that was sort of my start, and of course, start in the industry. And of course, I fell in love at a young age with King Kong, and same old story. King Kong. Up in Oregon, where I grew up, there were two channels. One was really fuzzy, and one was slightly less fuzzy. And they would do these sort of back-to-back, like at least once a year, probably because they didn't have to pay anything for them. They had the prints already, and they were public domain. They would show King Kong, Son of Kong, and Mighty Joe Young. And so, of course, my dad and I would always set up, for those screenings, and that was really great. And he also took me to the drive-in to see a reissue of Seventh Voyage of Sinbad when I was a little kid, and that just, blew my mind when the Cyclops comes out. The orange Cyclops, so that really hit me. And then I also, wanted to be a comic book artist when I was younger. And so, same old story with a lot of these guys, had a garage and would do films in regular 8 at home, and later discovered video. But I was lucky to get started pretty much a year out of high school working in the industry.
Interesting. That's cool.
That's amazing because we last episode we interviewed Jerry Conway, who took over writing Spider-Man from Stan Lee, and he was like 19 or whatever at the time. So I'm always amazed because 19, I was still sitting on the couch and watching TV and stuff.
Yeah. Speaking of Stan Lee, so back then in the 80s, the Vinton Studio, there was no way to people take CG for granted, but the only way to do a dimensional sort of cartoon, to do a caricature in 3 dimensions animated, was clay animation, or some form of stop motion animation. But the kind of clay that the Vinton Studio was doing, which was sort of like a Mad Magazine caricature come to life, that was really dependent on the artistic skill of that team. And so we were getting, it was really a big deal at the time. They had the Domino's Pizza Noid, the California Raisins, the KFC Chicken. They were all over advertising, and they had a few other, short film properties. So everybody was calling the studio. And I remember the story going that Stan Lee called the studio, and the receptionist answered. And when he said who he was, she said, "Stanley who?" Anyway, but he would talk to Will every once in a while about a project. I don't think they ever did anything, but
that would have been interesting. So, I mean, let's say like that Christmas special was probably half an hour?
Yeah.
And then how long did that actually take to animate?
It took about a little less than 6 months, and it was with a pretty big team. And I think normally in those days, I mean, it can be done more quickly than that. Like I worked a few years ago, I worked on the stop motion episode of the NBC show Community, which is really quite a funny episode. It's the Abed's Uncontrollable Christmas. And we shot that not with clay, but with, stop motion puppets. And we shot that in about, I want to say, a little over 8 weeks, which is very quick. But it can be done quickly like that. Like the old Gumby episodes were done very quickly. But with the claymation Christmas, I mean, it's very involved. A lot of resculpting. It takes a bit longer than other animation processes. So it had a pretty lengthy schedule and a pretty big crew. So I say a little bit under 6 months.
Yeah, I was going to say clay is probably a lot different than working with like models.
Yeah,
because you can't just keep bending it all over the place, right? I mean, eventually the arm's going to fall off or a leg's going to crumble or something.
You pretty much have to make a new puppet per shot because, you were re-sculpting it as you go. It's just a lump of mud, essentially. And one thing that would tend to happen is that you're looking, through the camera or close to through the camera while you're animating, and the sculpture of the face would gradually morph into a sort of more two-dimensional on a flat plane, so that because you were always sculpting to camera, by the end of the shot the whole head would kind of be warped, so that if you looked at it in 3 dimensions it wouldn't make much sense, but if you look at it from camera view it looks good. So pretty much you have to throw away the puppet per shot and build a new puppet. So yeah, it takes more time.
So you must go through a lot of clay when you're doing that.
Yeah, I mean they're tiny, but
yeah, and then all the backgrounds, that was all probably a combination of painted and models, or?
Well, I mean, it depends on who was designing it. Like Will had a thing about a pure clay world, but it really wasn't feasible, and it didn't make a lot of sense a lot of the time. I mean, we built some amazingly huge sets that were built, coated at least in clay, and they just weighed a ton. Eventually, the studio moved into a more sensible, more sensible materials, and would tend to build the sets more out of just pure wood or foam or things like that were more lightweight and aesthetically sort of more controllable. You have more ability to adjust color when you're not coating a layer of clay on. But for a long time, we did actually, everything had that clay aesthetic because there was a layer of clay. For a brick wall, it would be a piece of wood with, big old 1/2 inch thick layer of clay on it, and it just weighs a ton.
Wow.
how different things are done now as opposed to then. I mean, I only read about what you do. I'm not involved in the industry at all, Webster, but in one of the conversations we were having before the show, when you said that ILM doesn't have a shop anymore, everything's done CGI or through computer now. Is that right?
Well, I think the context for that little conversation was just talking about what it's like at Tippett Studios now, and Tippett is very much Tippett still has a stage building. It's pretty much in two buildings. One is more of what you think of as a modern CG facility, and the other building is the stage building where Phil still shoots and is still used for doing things like scanning models and shooting elements, or even shooting live action, or doing our own motion capture on the stage here. But it really is more reminiscent of like the way ILM or some of the shops with some of the VFX houses with a stage used to be. And when when Dennis Murin comes by to visit Phil, of course they go way back. They're always sort of excited to be around the physical stuff again. But it's completely different now. Your average VFX house is basically like an office building. It looks typically like any internet company or game studio. It's just a bunch of people at machines. There might be an area for shooting motion capture. There might be an area for taking photographs, but that's about it. It's pretty boring.
I'm wondering, Webster, one of the first professional jobs you were saying was the California Raisins commercial. You were involved in that. How long did that take in total? I don't know if you got into the model building or if you just animated the figures, but I'm just curious how long that segment took. It was a TV commercial, so it wasn't, it couldn't have been more than like 2 or 3 minutes, right?
No, 30 seconds.
Oh, wow.
And those would, on average, take about 8 weeks. 8 weeks was a pretty decent schedule for a 30-second commercial. And I should say I did not work on the first California Raisins commercial. That was directed by Bill Feasterman, and who's still in Portland, still is very active on Facebook. He's one of the guys who's most responsible for what you think of as the Vinton Studio style. He's a terrific caricature artist, graduate from the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena. I believe that's correct. And, just classical caricature work in the style of a Mad magazine. And he directed that first California Raisin spot that became so popular, but they didn't think that it was going to be a big deal when they did it, and he actually kind of felt, well, I don't want to get into this, but he thought I think he felt like it could have been a better commercial. We always feel that way about our own work, but if you look at the spot, it's fairly simple. And even some of the characters, the raisins, they just kind of slide around. They don't actually do a lot of action. So then when they hit huge, they did another spot afterwards with the guys on the construction, opening their lunches and seeing the raisins set up like a Motown act inside the lunchbox. And that was much more involved. And because that first spot just was huge, people all over the country were putting trash bags on and dressing up like the raisins for their high school acts and stuff like that. It was big. But 8 weeks is what it took, to answer your question.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you were to, or if they were to render something like that using today's technology, what do you think a turnaround would be? Would it still be 8 weeks, or I'm thinking it would be a shorter amount of time?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that computers are fast in terms of getting something out the door that looks, I would say, fairly mediocre, but gives you a pretty good idea of what it could be very quickly. So I do a lot of previs work, pre-visualization work, and it's very easy to get ready-made models off the internet and put something together in a matter of a day to show a client, what the final spot could look like. So to get something fully rendered again, and it wouldn't look as good or it wouldn't look the same as the claymation work, but to get something rendered, like that first California Raisin spot in CG would take a lot less time. But it's still, like I said, it doesn't have the same tactile feeling. I mean, computer animation is a different animal. Although there have been experiments done to make it look like clay that have been somewhat successful.
All of us here on Planet 8 are huge fans of Ray Harryhausen. I'm guessing you were a pretty big fan yourself growing up.
Yeah, huge fan. And I got to, in 1988, I think it was, I went to San Diego Comic-Con with one of the Vinton producers and with Spike from the late Mike Gribble from Mike and Spike. And I was on I have pictures to prove this, but I was on a panel with Ray Harryhausen at the San Diego Comic-Con. And and that's a whole nother thing. But I was blown away. That was the first time I met him. And then later, when he was the year he got his honorary Oscar from the Academy, Will very smartly brought him up. Will was doing, I think this was the second year it happened, but Will was doing this thing called the Portland Creative Conference, where he would bring all these people from various creative industries into town for this terrific 3-day conference. And he brought Ray the year he got his honorary Oscar, and he treated Ray very nicely, and Ray did a whole talk at the studio and hung out for a couple of days. And I was shooting a Play-Doh commercial at the time, and they brought Ray into my set, which was just, I don't have pictures to prove that, but that just, that's mind-boggling.
No, that's cool.
What's it like to have Ray Harryhausen looking over your shoulder while you're animating?
Well, he wasn't critiquing me, so it was fine. But it was just really, it was awesome, just to, have him there. I mean, he would make himself very available, to fans everywhere. He was always, very outgoing in terms of interaction with fans. But what was cool. But at the same time, he kind of had a shtick, you would hear the same stories again and again. Of course you would, he was a showman, and you wouldn't, you don't want to ad lib every time you're doing a presentation to a group of fans. So he kind of had the same stories again and again. But what was cool was we hung out with him at the Vinton Studio long enough that we got past some of the sort of, normal stories and got into a bit of on Clash of the Titans, how what kind of made him want to retire during production on that. He had a lot of difficulty on that show, and he talked a bit about the difficulties with, he was set back something like 6 months on that show because he was having trouble with some of the stock registration from Kodak. The registration of the perforations was causing problems in the final shots, and so that really threw a wrench in the works. And I think, So we got some different stories from him because we spent a lot of time with him.
That's great. So I guess eventually you had to make the transition to the CG world and all that. What was that like? Or was that, obviously you had to leave Vinton to do that somewhere else?
Well, the life of an artist or an animator, artists or animators are artists, but the life of sort of a commercial artist is fraught with ups and downs, and you end up being having kind of an itinerant lifestyle. So I was at the Vinton Studio through one round of layoffs, and then I was freelance for a while, and then I had my own company in Portland, and eventually I was very successful with my own company, but there was this point in history that won't happen again where, I'd worked on James the Giant Peach. So I came down in 1994 to work on that film in San Francisco for 3 or 4 months, just sort of as a fill-in animator. And there were 2 camps at Disney. There was a camp backing James the Giant Peach, and there was a camp backing Toy Story. The Pixar guys came by and visited one evening. We had a little party. Everybody in the animation world knew John Lasseter's short films and knew that, and expected that it was going to be a great film because he's just a great filmmaker. But I think Disney, the executives were unsure that a computer animated feature would hold audiences' attention for the full length of the film. So there were doubts. But after Toy Story was a huge success, all of the studio, and then DreamWorks started to form, the famous, Jeffrey Katzenberg, Spielberg, Geffen partnership that stole a lot of people or lured a lot of people over from Disney. There's books written about this. When that happened and the studios were starting up their expanding into the animation business and transitioning into CG, the studios were all really heavily recruiting for animators. So any animator with a pulse could get a pretty well-paying job in CG animation if they were willing to do the transition, and you would get paid while you were being trained. So, like I said, that's probably never going to happen again. But at that time, it was really interesting. There was a lot of competition in the marketplace, and so, I was in Portland, and I was talking to all of the studios. So I remember, I got a phone call from Phil Tippett. I got a phone call from the Pixar folks. I was at a recruiting thing up in Canada for Sony ImageWorks. They were going to do Dinotopia, and then there was DreamWorks, and I ended up choosing to go, to close my company and going to DreamWorks in Palo Alto. And the thing was, I had done a bit of computer animation with some guys. Am I going on too long here?
No, we've got an hour.
You're
all the
fine.
time you want.
Okay, so I'll try to make it short. But I had done a bit of computer animation with some guys in Vancouver, Washington. There was a company that's still around, I believe, run by a guy named Martin Hash. And if you talk to the computer animators, the hardcore old computer animators, they all know this software. It was called Animation Master, and it was one of the early Amiga-based and then eventually PC-based 3D animation programs. And it was all kind of done by this small group of engineers up in Vancouver, and it was actually fairly advanced for the time. And when I went then I'd chosen to go to DreamWorks PDI down in Silicon Valley, and I had no idea, what I was getting into. I had to, learn Linux Unix at the time, and even compared to the PC or Amiga-based system from the guys in Vancouver, like PDI's animation software was pretty arcane and archaic. You actually had to animate with a spreadsheet, and some of the people there still animate with a spreadsheet. So it was kind of like Pixar's software, but it was a few years less evolved. And so it was, in addition to having to transition from working by myself, directing my own commercials and dealing directly with clients, and transitioning from stop motion animation to the way working in CG, I had to learn to work in a larger studio structure. It was really a nightmarish experience, but I learned a lot fast. Oh, and on top of that, DreamWorks was trying to beat Pixar to the market with Ants versus Bugs Life, so I was in the middle of that too.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy times.
Well, I mean, you think back then, and it was like the big advance in CG was like Dire Straits' Money for Nothing, right? With the blocky square characters walking around, and then you look at how far it's come to today. It's amazing.
Well, that was a few years before. This would have been 97. And so Money for Nothing was a few years before that. Let's see, what would have been the contemporary for that time? Like PDI DreamWorks was one of the studios that had done a CG version of the Pillsbury Doughboy. So they were sort of on the forefront of that. Casper had just happened at ILM, or maybe, no, Casper hadn't even been done yet. They were doing Casper, I think, around the time that we were doing Ants. I want to think. Maybe it had been done. I'm not sure.
I know the.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just think always the first movie that I saw where I was really impressed with CG was probably Jurassic Park.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say that was early 90s. I probably should look it up.
I'm going to go ahead and look it up, even though I'm sitting here with, the dinosaur input devices are downstairs, actually, here.
1993.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so that was earlier. Interesting.
Yeah, because Phil was heavily involved in Jurassic Park, right?
Oh, yeah, totally, yeah.
But, yeah, that was like the first thing I remember seeing where I was really sold on it. And even now, going back and watching it when it comes on, it's like, and I know some of it, there was practical effects too, but the parts where it's clearly CG, it still looks pretty good.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, it still holds up today, definitely.
Yep. And Phil was, they had planned to do it, the whole story is out there of how they, were planning to do it with go motion, combination of stop motion and go motion puppets. And then, when Spielberg decided to go with the risky CG, and it really was a leap of faith because, the first test wasn't a fully rendered dinosaur with a skin. It was just a skeleton. Walking. It's a very crude test by today's standards, and yet he decided that, he'd take the leap of faith and trust that they could get it looking, something, realistic. And Phil adapted very, resourcefully. And one of the things they did was, along with Craig Hayes and Tom St. Amand, I believe, they built these physical puppet rigs that were like armatures with all of these encoders attached, so they could animate the dinosaurs with a stop motion like skeleton in physical space and input that data into soft image to do, to get the animation done. And Randy Dutra was one of the animators on that as well.
Oh, okay.
That's cool.
And those are downstairs actually in the building here.
That's all. I don't want you to break any rules or anything, but if you could snap a couple of pictures for us when we post the episode, we can throw it up on the web page. Sure. Of course, you need to. It needs to be a selfie, so you have to work that out. As with some of the older films, some of the older dinosaur films where they just plop in some lizards with some prosthetics glued onto them, hopefully not hot glue. Some of the CGI and Jurassic Park, I think, is like one of the crown jewels in computer animation. But it's that second Mummy movie with The Rock. What was it called? That was just some of the worst CGI.
Oh, is that what, Scorpion King?
Scorpion King.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh! I don't know what happened, if they ran out of money or if they.
No. I do know what happened from some guys I worked with. I worked at a great company, a VFX company called The Orphanage in San Francisco for quite a number of years. And it was down the street from ILM in the Presidio, or, the later ILM location in the Presidio. Right. And we would, hire a lot of ILM, ex-ILM, or sometimes ILM freelance people. And so I worked with a lot of people who had worked on the Scorpion King, including a bunch of animators. Or it wasn't the Scorpion King movie, it was the Mummy 2, right? And the Scorpion King appears at the end.
Right.
And, I've been lucky in my CG career to not have anything end up on one of those YouTube compilations like the worst CG ever. Which are unfair in a lot of ways because, like with the example with Cats, like the decision to put actors in for, augmented with CG or replaced entirely with CG, except for their faces, and not really understanding like what is the scale of the cat in the relation to the world, or having a change. All of those decisions are made at a higher level than the artist doing the CG work, so it's really unfair to blame the VFX for, a creative decision that is bad, so I've been lucky not to have anything on one of those worst CG ever reels, although I have worked on some things that I would say are pretty bad, but I won't mention them because I don't want them to end up on the reel. but that Scorpion King is always on those reels. And the deal with that was, and it was done at ILM, was he was originally, and this is a classic, this happens a lot, unfortunately, but he was going to be a background character and just like appear in shadow. And then at the last minute, the director said, I want him front and center, like medium close up. And so the model, and it was like, it was a hellacious movie to get done. I mean, there was a lot of stuff in that movie, and they were strapped for time, and they didn't have time to like remodel and retexture and re-rig the characters. So they just ended up with this thing that was supposed to be in the background, right up in front and center. And there was it just didn't hold up. It just, CG, you have to build, especially in those days, you have to build it from the beginning to have all of the controls built into and musculature built into a very sophisticated rig for it to move correctly, on top of the topology of the model being sculpted to hold up at high fidelity when you're close to it, plus the textures, and the hair. I mean, all of it. It's gotten easier over the years because the computers are faster, but it's still really hard to pull that all off. And so, when you take an asset that's meant to be, in the distance and is designed for that, and you put it close up on high resolution, it's just going to fall apart.
Right. That makes total sense. And I think I'll be a little more tolerant of the effects in that film. But it was something like that really, took us out of the movie. And now, I appreciate the background on that.
Well, I mean, it still happens too. I mean, look at people have forgotten about it already, but look at the Black Panther when it came out. I mean, people were complaining about how bad some of that CG was. There's some atrocious CG toward the end of the movie. And luckily, it was still a successful movie, but people did complain about it. And it just, it has more to do with schedule and changes, because it seems to be part of the culture now in Hollywood. It's always been part of the culture there, but to think that just changing things is a good idea.
Yeah.
So you tend to get these changes at the 11th hour in the schedule, and there's just no way, you can pull something off at a high level. Almost no way to do that every time.
Right. It was such a contrast between the Mummy reanimating. I mean, that still holds up today. His transformation back into his human form, and then the Scorpion King. Let me ask you: do you have any information on the Will Smith version of I Am Legend?
It's so funny you asked that. It's so funny that you asked that, because you talk about worst CG ever, and that also ends up, that's like the number one contender. And actually, I do completely know the story on that, and I was thinking about that when I mentioned the Scorpion King. Actually, the guy who was one of the animation supervisors on that for Sony is an old friend of mine who I'd worked with at DreamWorks, and he said that show, the effects ruined his career, because again, those characters were going to be seen in the distance and in crowds, and he was working with the team there to design these sort of crowd cycles to have those characters in the background. And I believe that, I'm not sure if that was because the facial close-ups were going to be done with prosthetics or not, although there are some amazing tests on Steve Johnson's Instagram or something from a couple years ago, or actually it's not Steve Johnson, but there's some tests on the internet from Steve Johnson's company at the time doing animatronically augmented prosthetics. So what they had was a sort of a cable or radio controlled headpiece that went down over the eyes and used the real actor's mouth, but with sort of radio controlled eyes, and it looks amazing. But for whatever reason, they decided not to go with that, and they took, and I don't know if this is exactly the timeline of events, but they took these characters at Sony that had been designed to be in these, running crowd scenes, and they did exactly the same thing with the Scorpion King, and they said, no, we're going to do them all in CG. We're going to put them front and center. And so it wasn't so much that the asset couldn't be redesigned to look good up close, but it was just sort of the bad decision to go with the old sort of standby of like a character's mouth opening impossibly wide, or long, and it's just creatively a bad call, They did that also on Planet of the Apes, the Tim Burton Planet of the Apes. They did, ILM did, some of the apes roaring, with sort of impossibly extended mouths, when you have nothing else to sort of go with, you sort of end up with that. Yeah. Well, it'll be weird because the mouths will be extra big, and they just took it way too far on I Am Legend. I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah.
Well, I think that kind of stuff has been going on like forever. I remember reading a story about it conquered the world, and the alien was supposed to just sit in the cave and do everything from there. And then Corman at the last minute said, "No, bring him out. He's got to fight the army." And exactly. So it was just like a big road cone sliding across the thing. So
exactly. Yeah, it's nothing new, sadly. But the I Am Legend one was, I wish Marco could speak for, or my buddy, maybe I shouldn't mention his name, but I wish he could speak for himself on this. But yeah, it had repercussions, the poor guy. But he's been successful since then, so no complaints.
Let me ask you this, Webster. What are some of your favorite projects or films that you worked on?
Well, a lot of the time, like, there's a couple of old sayings in Hollywood, but one of them, you tend to know when, based on the script, we, even with the VFX guys, you end up getting the script early on to go over it. And you can pretty much tell in the script stage whether it's going to be a good movie. Obvious. It seems like that's an obvious thing, but it's oftentimes not obvious that would be the case. But there are certain projects that I've been lucky enough to work on that were obviously going to be good right out of the gate. The ones that come to mind right off the bat are going sort of backwards in time are not because I read the script, but because of the creatives involved. The Deadpool movie, the first Deadpool movie. Ted, the first Ted movie, and The Host, which is Bong Joon-ho's monster movie from 2008. So now going forward, so I was the animation supervisor for the orphanage on The Host, and based on his track record, we just knew it was going to be a great movie. He's just a great, even back then, you just looked at his previous films like Memories of Murder, and he's just a fantastic filmmaker. And that movie movie would have been good even without the monster. It was a great movie. So we just had to not. Can I swear?
It's more like PG, but a screw up. Avoid a screw up would be acceptable.
Yeah, I can bleep stuff. So
screw it up.
Yeah, Bob will beep if needed.
Well, I'll just say we just had to not screw it up. But that's not the word we used when we were talking about it. And then going forward in time, much later, I was the on-set previs and later the mocap guy for Seth MacFarlane on the first Ted movie. And the script was great. So, and then they improvised on set. And you just knew that was going to be a great thing. So, and then later... I came back to the Bay Area. So I spent about 4 or 5 years in LA after the first Ted movie, doing a lot of work for Seth MacFarlane, and then moved back up here to the Bay Area to work for some old friends on the first Deadpool movie. And that, again, was one situation where you just knew, because of the people associated with it, that it was going to be great. I mean, the director... who runs we had worked with a lot of folks who had worked with him before, because Tim Miller has been running his own VFX studio and animation studio in Hollywood for decades, Blur Studio, and they do a lot of game cinematics. And he's highly respected in the CG industry. And so we knew that he would bring a great thing to it. And then the character, of course, is one of the sort of unsung heroes of the Marvel universe. So we all that was another show where we just and we were working with a VFX soup, Jonathan Rothbart, who we had worked with a lot over at the Orphanage. He was one of the founders of the Orphanage. So it was just a great opportunity to be associated with a great project that was really fun, you know. And we just had to also, again, not screw it up. And actually, I'm very proud of the work we did. We did the freeway chase sequence and a bit of the following sequence where he has a fight on top of the elevated freeway.
Very
with
cool.
The bullets, the counting down with the bullets.
Right. Yeah, I remember that scene.
Yeah. So those are 3 projects that I'm super proud to be associated with on the CG side of things.
Very cool. Let me ask you something. I'm a big fan of the Walking Dead, and the season finale is postponed. They made an announcement on the television program, the next to last episode, and they're like, we don't have time to do the visual effects, the music, and all the cleanup and stuff that they do, and so it's going to be released sometime after the shelter in place. Is this shelter in place affecting your guys' ability to? I don't know if you're working on any projects, and you don't have to disclose, anything. I don't want to get you in trouble. But how's that affecting your ability to do your work right now?
Well, I should, going back a little bit, I should mention that at Atomic Fiction, which is the sort of the group of folks from the Orphanage whom I worked with, I came back from LA to work with in Oakland when they sort of reformed to make this new company again called Atomic Fiction to work on Deadpool. One of the projects we worked on a couple of times there, we did some shots for the Walking Dead TV series, and it was just kind of one of these things where they would farm out various augmented blood or sword replacement shots to various VFX houses. It's fairly simple work, but so they send it out to a lot of different places. One of the things that's really interesting about that show and exciting is it's shot in 16 millimeter. I don't think many people in the public know that, but they were testing early on whether they wanted to shoot digitally or on film, 35 or 16, and they ended up going with Super 16 because I think one of the reasons is they're shooting in a lot of very light intensity because they shoot a lot outdoors, and you get a better dynamic range. Film is able to handle that better than digital. And then on top of that, being 16 millimeter, it sort of takes the kiss of death off of some of the makeups. Like it's a little bit softer, and so it gives you a better sort of more, it takes the edge off the makeup. You don't have to. You're not seeing every little edge of the prosthetic like you would if it was a digital show. And also, it kind of has a more gritty feel. So that's a huge contributor to the success of that show in my book. Is the
that's shot. Interesting too.
Now, are other shows shot that way, or is it just?
There's a few others. I can't name them offhand, but Walking Dead is the biggest one, and Kodak, as a matter of fact, opened up a film lab in Atlanta to help that action out. Yeah,
Kodak was probably saying, "We're saved."
Well, that's not enough to save Kodak, but it's one of the big reasons that it helps for sure. Yeah. There's still a lot of stuff being shot on film, and there's sort of a resurgence in that. And Christopher Nolan is a big advocate of film. He tries to shoot everything on film when he can.
Yeah.
So Walking Dead is one of the big ones. And what was the question? I'm sorry.
The shelter in place. Are there any projects that you're kind of like not able to finish or work on right now because of your inability to do what you do?
Well, there's a lot of different ways that it's impacted. Like, I still would love to go down to LA to work on some stop motion projects. And I was just chatting with some friends over at Stupid Buddy Studios, where they do Robot Chicken and a bunch of other shows. they've pretty much shut down because, you know, you have to have the crew physically in one place for that. I mean, I do a lot of stuff at home, personal, you know, or music video projects or just stuff for friends. And I've been doing, or personal films, and I'm just going crazy doing tons of that kind of work. So I'm having a good time doing that. But in the CG world, you know, we're sort of ahead of the game because, you know, CG artists have been moving. There's sort of been this virtual studio movement that's been gaining traction over the years, where people have their own licenses at home, and the work is sort of controlled through a central hub. And the studios, you know, some studios tend to exist as virtual studios where their workforce is working from home, and that's been going on. There's a trend toward that's been going on for for a decade or so now. So some studios are a bit ahead of the curve. Like some friends of mine in the previous world in LA, they're just fine. You know, they've been working from home already, and so there's no slowdown. For Tippett, we are a little bit behind the curve, but they've been very successful in a short amount of time getting a system that within the parameters, security is a big issue. You know, with digital VFX work, you know, the studios and like Disney have a very strict standard for digital, you know, security, so that their IP doesn't get out there.
Oh yeah, so, I can imagine.
Yeah, so within those limitations, that's why it's hard for a studio like a VFX house to set that up. So within those limitations, Tippett has adapted pretty quickly, and a lot of people are working from home. Now, me personally, I can only do a little bit of work because my wife is working from home. She works in a different industry, and she's working from home full time, and somebody's got to take care of the kids. So I'm the I'm the guy, you know, because they don't really need me full time at Tippett right now, and so I'm pretty much the in-home school facilitator, the IT guy, the janitor, and the lunch. Did you hear? I'm the lunch lady too. So that's
there you go.
I wear those hats, you know, more or less uncomfortably, but lunch lady is the one I'm easiest.
I don't know if I could picture you in a lunch lady outfit though.
It's comfortable.
Webster, is there anything, I guess what I'm wanting to ask you, is there a particular dream project, something that you would love to bring to the screen, whether it's a remake of something or something that nobody has ever brought to the screen that has been in your head and that you would love to do someday?
And don't give away any ideas, but
I won't. But there's a whole drawer full of those, Karen. I mean, there's so many projects I'd love to do. One of the ones that I won't be giving away an idea, and somebody else is going to do it anyway, but I would love to do, I've always wanted to do a stop motion version or even clay of Devil Dinosaur, Disney.
Yeah. The Marvel comic. Yeah, that would be great.
So I probably won't do that, but I'd love to do that. There's a children's book that I'd love to adapt into a really, cute clay animation style, children's clay animation style short film or maybe half-hour show, and that was Sid Hoff's Danny and the Dinosaur. I've always wanted to do that. Mm-hmm. And then I have a bunch of personal projects that I'm working on. I'm doing a zombie movie actually with sort of cartoony zombies that are a combination of puppet and stop motion. So that's really fun. And I love the Italian zombie movies and Dawn of the Dead, with the drumming, it's synthetic soundtrack. And so I'm working with a musician friend and I've got my kids in it and we're just making this funny zombie movie. And so that's a dream project that I'm actually doing, but it's slowly doing it slowly because of the schooling and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Right. Cause you have to serve lunch.
That's my dream lockdown project.
Well, Webster, we're coming towards the end of the podcast, and honestly, I could go on for a few more days, just getting to know you better and some of the stuff that you've done and are doing. We'll do a round robin. Bob, Karen, you have anything else you wanted to ask Webster about before we get into our censor sweep?
Well, did you want to rattle off like any of the other things you've done? I know you've done like some pretty famous shots in movies that I think a lot of the listeners would instantly recognize.
Sure.
Well, I'll tell you what, too, Webster. I mean, go ahead and name them off, but we will have you back because I know you want to step into the Monster Garage and just take a look at everything that Bob has. So I'm sure you'll be back on, but please go ahead and rattle off some of those projects and films.
Well, I'm actually relieved. I was worried that I was going to be asked some deep knowledge questions about Ultraman or Godzilla that I wasn't going to be able to answer. I'm a bad.
That's your second appearance. We went light on you this time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, but I really want to see the Monster Garage. I've only seen it in pictures, and I'm bummed that I've never been there in person. But I should also say that like some of the projects I've worked on, oftentimes, you ask me what are some of the favorite projects to be associated with. Sometimes you have the best time working on the worst movie.
Right.
So one of the projects that was the second Henry Selick project that I worked on was Monkey Bone for 20th Century Fox. And it was a kind of an awful production. Like it was, we got shut down right before Christmas and everybody was going broke. And it was sort of, the studio we were working at was in a bad part of town. And just everything about it was sort of haphazard. But it was we had a great time doing it, and the work that we did is pretty cool. And what's funny is I wear my Monkey Bone crew jacket out in the world now, and people look at it and go, I love that movie. And it's like, where were you?
Right.
It was in the theater 2 weeks, and I still have the Roger Ebert and Siskel review of it on tape somewhere, and they just raked it over the coals. And the other movie that was in the theater at the same time, the other big movie was Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man, starring Johnson. And it lasted longer in the theater than Monkey Bone.
Oh, jeez.
So, oh, my God. Anyway, but we had a good time working on it, and a great team. And then another movie I worked on later in the CG realm at the orphanage was a Uwe Boll movie. Uwe Boll, German director. And it was a movie where Burt Reynolds was the king. And it also starred the guy from the Scooby-Doo movies who plays Shaggy. And it also had the karate guy. I can't remember his name. Anyway, it was a good cast, and it had Ron Perlman, too. It had everybody.
Oh, wow.
And it was called In the Name of the King, a Dungeon Siege Tale, which was based on a video game. But it was this horrible movie, Uwe Boll, as you would expect. But we had a really good time working on it, and we did some really quite good CG effects. We did this whole crowd system, and we had this crowd of, hundreds of soldiers that we did in CG. And it looks really, the effects look really good in an otherwise, terrible movie. And that's something you do a lot in CG effects. You do the best parts of shitty movies, or even in stop motion. Like if you look at some of those old movies that say like Project Unlimited worked on, the famous VFX house in Hollywood, like Journey to the Seventh Planet. The best part of that movie is the rat monster. That's in just a few shots, but it just goes by, really quickly, and that's the whole reason you want to go see it, Anyway, what was the question again?
Well, just naming off some of the things you've done that probably listeners would instantly recognize.
Well, more recently, one of the things I did the previs for the Planet of the Apes movie where, what was it? It was number 3 in the Planet of the Apes series or was it the most recent one? It was the one where, no, it was the second to the last one where the bad guy Koba, the bad monkey, he hops on a tank, and it's a POV shot of the tank, and it's one really long, like 350 frame shot, or longer actually, of the camera mounted to the tank, and it ends up with these CG apes on it, and it ends up crashing through a building. Now I did the previs on it, And then later, when I was on the Ted movies, I ended up working with one of the guys who was on set for it, and I verified that for the shoot, that they did indeed look at the previs. And then finally, of course, the effects were done by Weta, and I guess that was the most number of iterations of any shot that they've ever done, like something like, I don't know, at least 200 different, versions of that. I think way more. But, and that's nothing to be necessarily proud of, but the shot is kind of really memorable. And so I was involved in the design early on. So that's a good one. Then, of course, there's a lot of big shots in The Host. On James and the Giant Peach, I did the spider wrapping her spider web up into a bundle to catch the seagulls. What else? That's all that comes to. Oh, Superman Returns, which I didn't get a credit on. I did the shot of the faster than a speeding bullet shot. I also worked on the bullet bouncing off Superman's eye, but I wasn't the only one. Like, I didn't have a lot of creative input into that. That was actually designed by a previous guy in LA, and then somebody else did the rigging. But I was involved in it, but not heavily.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. What else? Oh, Planet Terror, the Robert Rodriguez movie. We had a whole sequence in there. Well, I'll tell you. Here's what it was. A few years ago, I met Quentin Tarantino at a screening at Skywalker Ranch, and one of my things I told him, I have to tell you this. I animated your penis, and in yeah. So in Planet Terror, in the Robert Rodriguez segment, Quentin Tarantino plays one of these infected soldiers who then is threatening to rape Rose McGowan. But as he's approaching her, he's melting. And there's this whole CG penis that is melting. And Robert Rodriguez had a very specific way he wanted it to move, like taffy falling. And so we would have we had a whole crew on it at the orphanage doing this melting penis sequence. And so, of course, when I finally met Quentin Tarantino, I said, I got to tell you this because I worked on your, I worked on it. So anyway, he thought that was funny, of course. And then we also worked on, at the orphanage, we had a good rapport with Robert Rodriguez. And we did a bunch of shots on Planet Terror. And we did, for Grindhouse, the two film package, we also did some work on Death Proof, which I think is one of my favorite Quentin Tarantino movies. And the work we did on that was fairly seamless. It was just, they had a sort of a air cannon to make the car flip over that they needed sort of masked over. It was basically like rig removal type of work, invisible CG work. But we did a lot of work on the Planet Terror sequence from Robert Rodriguez, including flipping a tow truck scene and the faces of the actors sort of bubbling, and then, of course, the melting penis. Yep. My big
on that note. Well, I'll tell you, Webster, you left great memories with us before that story, and now they're even greater.
Or not. It's okay,
It's interesting the kind of work that you go from James and the Giant Peach to Planet Terror. It's interesting, though, about Death Proof, because I'd read somewhere that there's a lot of digital effects that go into movies, like, the last, it wasn't Rocky, it was his
Rambo?
No, not Rambo. It was the
Creed.
kid. Creed, yeah. And there was like 250 effects in that film. And sometimes it's just cleaning stuff up or making something more defined, or, it's not always like the sword through the skull or the spider jumping out, from the shadows or whatever. So that was interesting. Everything needs an effect.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, filmmaking today is a lot. It's not easy, but it's a lot easier than it used to be, because it's so, you can fix little things that would cause you to have to do reshoots. Like, one of the things I remember a film that I'm a big fan of, the Time Machine, George Pal's Time Machine.
Oh, yeah.
There's a scene, it was very low budget, like $792,000, something like that, just under $800,000. There's a scene where the actor, I can't remember his name, but he cuts his hand on the prop, on the Time Machine prop, and he just keeps acting, but you clearly see the blood on his hand and on the prop as the scene is going. And they couldn't, for that time, there's nothing you could do. It's just in the movie, and you hope people don't notice. But these days, of course, there are a lot of subtle little effects like that are easier-ish to do. They are easy, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. It's interesting. Well, again, Webster, thanks for being on the show. We look forward to having you on physically in studio or in the Monster Garage. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing some of your stories and knowledge. And don't forget those selfies.
I'll take them right after this. Yeah. Well, I mean, we got to have fun during the lockdown. If you can't have fun in a lockdown, I mean, what are we going to do when the zombies hit? How are we going to?
Yeah, right.
Well, that's the thing. We're all sitting around usually going, "Oh man, I got to go to work. Oh, I got to work." And now it's like, gee, I wish I could go to work.
Yeah.
They're having me work from home, my day job. And it's like, well, do I put on clothes or just stay in my pajamas? I don't know. But anyway.
And what your pajamas are, of course.
Yeah. Star Wars, of course.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Well, this is the point in our show where we have our sensor sweep, and this episode's sensor sweep goes over to our reconnaissance officer. Kick it up to the satellite. Karen, take it away.
Well, Larry, this time around, I've got this huge book, this incredible tome that is part of author Mark Cushman's These Are the Voyages series. So
yes.
I know you're familiar with them, and I can't at the moment recall if I've spoken about them on the show before, but These Are the Voyages. Mark Cushman has written 3 books already in the series that cover the 3 seasons of original Star Trek. They're all very good books. I highly recommend them. But this new book that has just come out is subtitled Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek in the 1970s, 1970 and 1975. So what do we get in this? It's kind of a mishmash of all the things Gene Roddenberry was doing right after Star Trek and just before Star Trek the Motion Picture. So you get some of the movies he did, like Planet Earth, Genesis 2, the Quester tapes. You get a whole bunch of the book dedicated to Star Trek, the animated series. So some very interesting stuff on that. And then even some things that didn't happen, which I didn't know about, like the fact that right after the second season of Star Trek, he was working on a script for a Tarzan movie, which never happened. And then some other stuff that we would probably have to save for Planet 8 After Dark, like his work on a film called Pretty Maids All in a Row, which had Angie Dickinson and Rock Hudson. I won't say much more about that. But anyway, for the Star Trek completists out there, it's a very worthwhile read, and Mark Cushman has done a great job with all of his Star Trek books, so highly recommended.
I like the other books about seasons 1, 2, and 3. So you were saying Tarzan?
Yeah, apparently Gene Roddenberry was a big Tarzan fan. He had read Edgar Rice Burroughs' books growing up, and so he wanted to do Tarzan. And he had some very specific ideas about how Tarzan should be done. He didn't like a lot of the Tarzan movies that had already been made with the, me, Tarzan, you, Jane kind of stuff. He wanted to be more faithful to the original books. So, but
and
he
in the books, he was very eloquent. He,
right,
like an English gentleman type.
Yeah, there was the side of him that was in the jungle, but then there was the English, nobleman side. So he wanted to do that. But then Gene, there was this side of Gene that was very focused on, how shall I put it?
Getting the bleeper ready.
Yeah, getting the bleeper ready. Let me just put it, he was a lusty man. Let's just put it that way. He was full of passion, and he wanted his projects to be the same way. And so, yeah, let's just say it's interesting reading all the way around. Mm-hmm.
We'll leave it there.
Well, the Tarzan thing, though, just hitting on that really quick. When was Greystoke? When did that come out? That was like in the 70s, wasn't it?
No, that was 80s.
Like early 80s, right?
Okay.
There was the Bo Derek movie, I think, was in the 70s.
Ugh.
Yeah.
And then I think Greystoke was early 80s with, Christopher Lambert?
Yeah. I was just wondering if that somehow morphed into Greystoke, but
I don't think so. I think because his script actually, it seemed like it incorporated a lot of science fiction elements with sort of these lost cities and kind of, I don't know, lost technology, all this kind of stuff.
Well, in the books, I know Tarzan did go to the Earth's core, and I don't know. I don't think he ever mixed up with John Carter, but
but there were a lot of elements that I think Roddenberry took from the books that just haven't materialized in any of the films yet.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, kids. Well, if you get a chance, pick it up. Let us know what you think. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Out.
On that note, this will conclude this transmission from Planet 8. We would like to thank all of our intergalactic audience for listening. Be sure to head on over to our website at www.planet8podcast.com, where you can get more information on this episode's topic.
For more conversation, find us on Twitter at Planet8Cast.
Or on Facebook at facebook.com/Planet8Podcast.
We want to thank you guys for tuning in each and every episode. We look forward to your input and opinions. Until next time, this is Planet 8 signing off. End transmission.
By George, he's got it. It is the end.
Program complete.